okay, here's all the people we're going to be talking to. Get familiar with all these people, all these representatives. And you go and you look at their accomplishments. You look at their accomplishments, like their bios, and they list their accomplishments. And you get like this. Here's what I've done.
Right.
I passed the Sturdy Act that benefits children. Yeah. I passed a law that benefits older Pennsylvanians. I helped pass a law that helps people get to work on time. And that's their accomplishments. That's their accomplishments. Pardon my French. But that's what they claim. Here's what I've done in my career for justice and equity. I passed the Sturdy Act that tells people to nail their stupid couches to the floor.
Wait a minute. Couches? You've got to be kidding me.
No, I don't know about couches, but yeah.
Anything that could fall over on a kid.
That's a couch.
The couch is not going to fall over on a kid.
I guess it depends what your couch looks like.
I guess it depends on your kids, too.
If you're one of those artsy people.
Maybe in the Saint household.
Yeah, those artsy people, you never know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
Well, of course, this bill had the support of IKEA, Room and Board, Crate and Barrel, and Williams-Sonoma. So, of course, all the big companies are on board with it. It's probably a law that's supposed to affect the producers of this furniture.
Yeah, they'll be the ones coming out. They can more easily retool to comply with the law
and sell you the brackets,
right? Whereas the small, the big company is going to be behind something like this.
I'm going to have to take this with me on job sites now, because they tell you what you need and how to do it.
Anchoring your furniture is quick, easy, and costs very little. What other horrific regulation have these people ever passed that is quick, easy, and costs very little?
So it says here, since 2000, more than 460 U.S. children have died from tip-overs, so furniture tip-overs. And then it says U.S. Senators Bob Casey, Amy Klobuchar, blah, 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 announced the Senate passage of the Stop Tip-Overs of Unstable Risky Dressers on Youth Sturdy Act, legislation to prevent furniture tip-overs resulting in injury or death. So This is a good introduction to our welcome to the Lancaster Patriot podcast. By the way, this is a good introduction to our conclusion of Thomas Paine, if you will, common sense. And here's a law, here's legislation. It's not coming from the King of England. It's coming from right here in the U.S. of A. And this is what we need. If we don't have the ability to make our own laws like this, we're not going to be prosperous. So we want to talk about Thomas Paine concluding thoughts, and then we want to get into a little bit of Title VII, actually, and a case involving Gerald Groff here in Lancaster County, who his case went to the Supreme Court recently. So, Joel, let me start with you. We have this legislation. This is an example of man-made law here coming from the U.S. What are your thoughts on Paine's arguments? We talked a little bit about Chapter 1 two podcasts ago. And mainly Chapter 3 and 4 we want to briefly touch on now. And Paine really argues there that, the king's not going to be able to make laws that benefit us. We need to make our own.
Yeah, Paine, of course, is, at least at this point, seems to be arguing not so much against English rule. He considers himself an Englishman. But he's arguing against the king. And he's arguing against the ability of the king to make laws that affect us over here in the U.S. of A. Well, of course, it wasn't called the U.S. of A then. Over in the colonies, of course. And the difficulty I have with Paine is he's terrific at saying, well, this king stinks. He's no good. We got to reject him. But he's really light on what the answer really needs to be. I maintain that if you get away from the law of God, you'll be kind of, shall we say, tentative, even in fear of proposing new laws to some degree, unless you're a good old-fashioned tyrant. You'll be slow to do that, as you should be, because how do you ever know, without a transcendent law from God, how do you ever know that your new law is not going to be worse than the old law that you just opposed? Could it possibly be? I don't know, Thomas Paine isn't here to talk to today, but could it possibly be that we could get a tyrant, as was said before, in England, and trade him for a tyrant here? I mean, are we supposed to feel better that we have a tyrant in the U.S. or again in the colonies, maybe for governor, who's just as bad or worse than the tyrant in England. In other words, what is going to stop tyranny no matter where it comes from? And I think Paine is really light on that point. He said, we have a tyrant in England, yes. But how's he going to stop the tyrant next door? He's really light on that. In fact, I don't see where he says that at all.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about that 2 episodes ago, and so I just want to bring up here in Chapter 3 of Common Sense, he talks a lot about, he says, this continent can make no laws but what the king gives it leave to, and then he says we may be as effectually enslaved by the want of laws or lack of laws in America as by the submitting to laws made for us in England. So, Luke, what do you think about that? We may be as effectually enslaved by the want of laws in America as by the submitting to laws made for us in England. And also your general thoughts as we wrap up on Common Sense here and talk about man-made law and Paine's argument.
I don't disagree. I mean, every nation needs law, so he's correct about that. We do need laws, and his arguments rejecting a foreign king are sound, as the Bible says. Choose wise men from among you. The king was not from among them. The king was a foreigner that was not acquainted with what they had to deal with. Every nation has its own problems, and they need their rulers to know and be acquainted with those problems, as was pointed out in that movie I love to talk about, the Jack Bull, which was a HBO movie back in the late 90s with John Cusack and John Goodman, where a man was trying to sell his horses, was trying to sell some horses at market, but he was traveling through some land, and he was traveling through the Wyoming territory, and he came across somebody else's property, and the guy had set up a fence and said, okay, you got to pay to get through my property. Long story short, the man ended up getting defrauded because the other guy was taking advantage of him. And when they went to court, the defendant, the plaintiff, brought the case against the man who stole his horses, essentially, and said, I gave you 2 horses as collateral, and you agreed to keep them for me until I came back because I couldn't pay the toll to get through your land. And when you gave me back the horses, they were a bag of bones, and they were neglected and they were abused. And the defendant said, "Oh no, he gave me bad horses." But then the judge said to him, "I know this area. I know these people. There's no way that this guy gave you bad horses. Nobody does that. Nobody takes bags of bone horses to market to sell them all the way across Wyoming territory. So I know you're lying." But that was an example, as you pointed out, Dad, of a man who was from among the people who would know you're lying. Whereas me, if I was transported back then, I'm actually believe that lie because I'm not acquainted with horses. So, the argument that we need people who are around here, who know these people, who are among these people, that is a sound argument. However,
that's Paine's argument that the king can't govern us. King so far away.
Yeah, from so far away because he's not acquainted with our problems. So the argument is sound. However, I'm going to quote you here, Chris. I believe here it says point on Article 2, point B, number 3. Is this all lofty words without substance? And I'm going to quote you here, Chris, in your notes here. What law? Question mark. Exclamation mark. Question mark. Exclamation mark. Question mark. Exclamation mark. Question mark. Exclamation mark. Question mark. That's the question. That's the question for Thomas Paine. What law, Thomas? If you substitute the tyranny of a foreigner for the tyranny of the local people, what have you done essentially? And that's what happened. That's what happened. Historically, we know that's what happened. We substituted the tyrannical laws of a king for the tyrannical laws of a legislature, the tyrannical rulings of a Supreme Court, and the tyrannical executions, if you will, of the president, of the executive branch.
This is so frustrating because it would be one thing if the Bible really did just tell us how to get to heaven. Mm-hmm. If that's all it did. Mm-hmm. But we do have laws in the Bible about how to get along with each other. And it's so frustrating that we'll take anything except that. Anything, any legislative body, any I don't know, Cicero or any Roman orator, anything except the one that God wrote. And I can understand this from the pagans. It's the Christians that have me upset here. You talk about which laws and so forth, and Paine saying, the King of England, whatever. I want the local. And you're right, Luke. I mean, what if we get a tyrant? What if we get a local tyrant who might be harder to get rid of, right, than the one across the ocean? How do we get away from tyranny? And there's only one way. It's the embrace of God's law, and it's the one thing that the Christians will stand up and say, oh no, anything but that. The Christians I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's beyond frustrating.
Yes.
Well, I think that is in large part due to the fact that we don't actually know it. We don't actually know God's
true.
law.
It's very true.
I mean, I went to Bible college. I went to seminary. We really didn't study God's law. Not much.
Why do you think that was? Why? I mean, how many years were you in seminary, Travis?
I mean, I went for a long time because I had a family.
Yeah,
so I was
you
doing
did the
part-time
treadmill
and
thing.
stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But
you have multiple classes, and how many years
Right.
were you in Bible college also before you were married, or is that
I got
it?
a 4-year degree, here at Lancaster.
Maybe the equivalent of like maybe 6 years, and you didn't study God's law, right?
Well, I mean, we did, but it wasn't.
Only to dismiss it, maybe, kind of.
I'll put it kind of like when I went to the academy for law enforcement, we really didn't study the Constitution. We weren't even required to read the Constitution.
Wow.
And I don't think that's abnormal. I think that we were required to read through the Pennsylvania Code, things like that, so that you were familiar with the traffic laws and the criminal laws and all those things, but we weren't required to read the Constitution of Pennsylvania or of the United States. And I think that's kind of a parallel to what happens. Now, I understand why it happened here in Lancaster. I went to Lancaster Bible College, which is a historically dispensational school. And if you're a dispensationalist, which is a huge problem in America and in Lancaster County as well, along with the Anabaptist mentality, that the Old Testament really doesn't have a whole lot to say to us as the church, because we're New Testament people,
To be consistent, it has nothing to say to us. To be consistent,
Some would actually say that.
Yeah.
I mean,
those are the honest ones, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I've actually been at a church over in York where there's some type of brethren, I forget exactly which kind, but I remember my wife and I were there for a wedding, and I was just sitting in the pew waiting for things to start, and I see a Bible in the pew, and I'm like, this looks strange, and I get it out. It has no Old Testament
Oh my
in
goodness.
it.
Oh my
Right.
goodness.
And I'm like, what is going on? And I open it up, and there's a little note in the front, and they're like, we're New Testament Christians.
Right.
We don't think this applies to us anymore. I was like, wow, these guys are like consistent.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
consistent.
Like,
Yeah.
just get rid of it.
I think it's so interesting that if for red letter Christians out there, that the red ink essentially stops after John.
Yeah.
And if you're to put the Old Testament quotes in, say, in blue ink, after Christ ascends and the book of John is finished, after that you pretty much get only blue ink when it comes to quotations. They don't ever really quote Christ; they quote the Old Testament. The blue ink just keeps on going. The apostles, when they're writing stuff down, I mean,
Yeah, which is in Peter.
Yeah, Peter
quotes the Old Testament.
quotes the Old Testament.
He doesn't quote Christ.
Doesn't quote Christ at all. And I'm like, I mean, how could you possibly be just a New Testament guy? Are you paying attention? And I think it's funny too. Growing up, Dad used to work at Denver Cold Storage, a bunch of Mennonites there. And the arguments you had to inform them that love your neighbor as yourself was from the Old Testament.
this was
they had
like-
no idea. They had no idea that it was from the Old Testament.
Right.
They had no idea, and they were like shocked, right? You had to explain it to them.
Yeah, it was the weirdest thing. I mean, we used to talk about the flat. They'd call it the flat Bible. Yeah, I believe in a flat Bible. Like the Old Testament and the New Testament are equally authoritative. They call that a flat Bible. I mean, it's weird. Some of the topics we talked about, kind of, well, one of them was like vengeance. This is the New Testament. Nowadays, it's vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. Oh, well, where did he say that? Oh, he said that in the Old Testament.
Right.
And this came as like news to these dear people.
Yeah, but it's a huge problem in the church, and it severely truncates our understanding of the New Testament when we don't have as the foundation, especially the Pentateuch. You know, the first 5 books of Moses. That was what the kings were supposed to write down with their own hand under the supervision of the priests when they first go into office. They're supposed to read every day. You know, it was really important.
Yeah, but do you think, Travis? I mean, even if you're saying, well, they don't know it, and which is true.
Yeah,
they choose not to know it.
I don't think they're encouraged to know it, though. I think it's a problem of pastors not encouraging the people to.
But where does this come from, Travis, do you think? In other words, I'm sort of kicking the can down the road here. If they don't know it, why don't they know it? Why are they discouraged from knowing it? What is going back there? I mean, we talked before, I believe, about how, Christ, for example, there, Matthew 4 and Luke 4, quotes Deuteronomy in the temptation there, right? And he should have been saying, well, hey, you know what? That's Old Testament, I'm here to supplant the Old Testament. How about what I say, right? He doesn't even quote himself. He quotes Moses of all people, right?
Which is ultimately himself.
Exactly. He does quote himself, right? Of course he does. What, in the face of such obvious things, what is going on? How did this start to grow where we just... We have, your average churchman, I would say, has more antipathy. You guys can argue with me more. Hates the law of God worse than half of Karl Marx. Am I on a limb here too far?
I mean, I don't know if I go that far, but I would say that
a quarter of Karl Marx. Government
Some
education.
Of it. Yeah. I mean, they're on board with most of Karl Marx's 10 planks.
I would say that it depends what church you're at, first of all. But I think most people, it's just this unknown, strange thing. You know, like as a family, we're reading through scripture together. And as you're reading through some of the Old Testament books, it's strange. Like, what does this mean? And, we have a lot of good conversations about it. But it just does feel very distant in some ways. And I think that there's a lot of hard study and thinking and meditating that needs to happen, and it's just not easy.
Regarding the pastors and what they think about God's law, Chris, I think it was you who quoted this in your book. I think it was you. But the Corinthians passage about the things of the Lord are folly to those who are perishing. That includes the law.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that was me, but I'll take credit for it.
Okay.
Wait a minute. You just went beyond what any of us are saying.
Well, the pastors have...
That's quite a thing.
The pastors have not been backed into a corner yet. That's what I'm saying. They haven't been backed into a corner. And when backed into a corner, they're either going to say, yes, it's folly, or no, it's wisdom. And the problem is they haven't been backed into a corner. And I think that's what the church needs to do. Their leaders need to be backed into a corner. Yes or no? Is the law of God a good idea? If the law of God is a bad idea, that's an indication of your Christian state. It really is. Because if you're saying this is folly, the law of God is folly, then you're saying the things of the Lord are folly. What does that say about your state concerning, whether or not you're perishing? Because it says the things of the Lord are folly to those who are perishing, for they are spiritually discerned. And that is sorry, no, it was not you. It was someone else. It was an article a friend of mine had shared with me that he had written about natural law.
You don't get to claim that anymore.
Yeah, sorry, Chris. Right. I was trying to remember, but
you can put it in your next book.
Yeah, but his point is true, that the law is something that's from the Lord and it needs to be spiritually discerned. And pastors have not been backed into a corner regarding the law of God. They have not been pushed. Is it a good idea? Yes or no? Is it just? Is it true? is it good? And most of the pastors have not been backed into that corner. And I want to see every single pastor in this nation backed into that corner. Yes or no, is the law of God a good idea? And the congregations need to be pushing their pastors into that corner.
Your basic pastor, though, is going to twist and turn. He's going to flip flop like a mackerel on a deck. You ask that question. I'm saying it's bad. But we have to have the right perspective and all. I mean,
it can be done though, because we did it.
Yeah,
we did it. We did it with that breakfast. We asked that one pastor, "Do you owe Caesar 100% of your taxes? Yes or no?" And the answer was, "Yes, you do." Didn't twist
Caesar
anymore.
asks,
I mean, he was twisting before, but they didn't twist anymore. He said, came out and said yes. So if with enough hard work and enough patience and enough, honestly, I'm going to say this, but enough brotherly love, if you have that discussion with your pastor, and
that was more like brotherly shove, but it was,
but patience is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
and respect.
You're right. It did take us a while to get there in that conversation.
Yes,
it did take some time, but
yes.
You're right. I mean, the pastor was ultimately honest, if you will.
Yes.
Said, you know what? If the state asks, and of course I know I've said oftentimes, state doesn't ask. Right? Doesn't come in there. Oh, please. No. They come with penalties.
Yes.
They come with punishment, and they make it easier for you to pay up than not to pay up. Okay. But he did say at the end, hey, if the state demands 100% of your income, they get it. Mm-hmm. So, but it did take a while. And the only way you can come up with an answer like that, if you're a pastor, is if you believe that God's law is a bad idea, because God's law puts limits on the civil magistrate, and he was not willing to admit that or agree to that. Well, I mean, either God's law is limitless or man's law is limitless. Let's not forget that. And for him, man's law is limitless.
And I think that's something we weren't really confronted with in the last generation until the last couple of years.
Yeah.
It was kind of a new thing for people to really have to wrestle with, because we just kind of cruised along on cruise control for so long.
Yes.
Even though there were a lot of signs of things going in the wrong direction, you had Francis Schaeffer and others in the previous generation trying to point these things out.
But we're seeing the fruit of their hard work, because the Christians are starting to, as a whole, the Christians are starting to be forced to deal with these things, whereas before we could ostensibly afford to ignore them for a long time.
Ostensibly, we could afford.
Ostensibly, I mean, we couldn't.
Right. We couldn't, and we shouldn't.
We shouldn't,
because we didn't love our freedom enough.
No,
we didn't love enough. So we were willing to put up with infringements on it as long as we were still comfortable.
Right.
What's happening now is our comfort's being challenged.
That's what Dave Stoltzfus often tells me. Until these people lose their vacation home, their retirement, their second, their whatever. Until they lose those things, they don't care about this stuff. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, by and large, the American church has come to enjoy their prosperity given by God, and until that's taken away, it's going to be very hard to rouse them from their apathy.
Right. As long as they can still watch their NFL, as long as they can still sit on their couch and play their video games and have their Twinkies and all that stuff, then I don't really need to deal with this.
The Romans had it right. Bread and circuses, baby.
Yep.
You can take away their liberty bit by bit. Just keep up with the bread and the circuses. Keep their stomachs full and keep them distracted. We're good. But that's on us, that we don't love our freedom. That this freedom given to us by Christ, we're a little bit like we're a lot like the old like the Old Testament children of Israel. All these good gifts of God, the new land, too much responsibility, back to Egypt with you.
Well, and then there was constantly these layers. If you look through Exodus, God kept having to put more and more layers between him and the people because of that very attitude. Moses first comes down from Sinai with the tablets that God wrote on himself. And the people are down there playing around, fornicating with this golden idol, Yeah. So then the next time he comes down, he has them in a box, right? And then he has to put them inside of the ark, which then has curtains between, there's all these layers then. So it's really the same type of thing. People just want to insulate themselves. Like you were saying before, do we actually love God's law? do we actually want to, I think you said to me before, do we want to cozy up to God's law, or do we want to just keep it at a distance? And that's oftentimes the problem. We don't want to be directly confronted with God's presence and his demands on us and what he expects of us.
And what do we have if we don't have that? What do we have if we don't have God right by us like they did? I mean,
God's so near to us. Okay,
yes.
God's so near to them.
What other nation has God so near to them?
Yes.
From Deuteronomy chapter 4.
Yeah.
Right.
So near, he was a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day.
Well, I want to maybe spend the next 5 or 10 minutes wrapping up some thoughts on Thomas Paine. There's much more we could get into there, and then I do want to spend a little time talking about this Title VII and this Groff case. But Joel, real quick, Travis mentioned we don't know God's law. What would be a good resource book, reference book to how to understand the civil law from the Old Testament?
Yeah, I would start with something very, well, if you want to say digestible, R.J. Rushdoony's Law and Liberty, quite frankly. It was a series of radio addresses, and it was given, it's not really chapter 1, then chapter 2, chapter 3. You can pretty much read any chapter you want. The reason why I like that book so much, Chris, is because he shows the practical application of the wondrous nature of the application of God's law and connecting it to freedom. Now, if you love security rather than freedom, you're not going to like God's law no matter what book I throw at you, of course.
Right.
Because it's just too much responsibility. But then getting into it more deeply, Rushdoony's Institutes of Biblical Law, it actually just lays it out. And a lot of people complain about that. So, okay, you theonomists, okay, where's your practical application? Well, we have an awful lot of practical application for you if you want to embrace it. So I would say his volume 1 and volume 2 of his Institutes of Biblical Law are excellent on this point. Also, Greg Bonson's Theonomy and Christian Ethics is another excellent connection, if you will. The initial, I know you didn't ask this, Chris, but see, the mentality that we bring to God's law is that it's a bad thing. And you have to, first of all, get through that barrier. Taught all our lives that, oh yeah, we God's law is bad, despite Paul saying, I delight in the law of God. Am I going too far by saying that Paul says I delight in theonomy? Is that too much? The law of God, I delight in that. Despite that, and despite the quotations, Luke, to your point, we need that done to be done. Mm-hmm. Old Testament quotations in blue throughout the Old Testament. Problem is, what do blue and red make?
Purple.
Purple. Mm-hmm. So when Christ quotes the Old Testament, that would have to be purple, right? I don't know how we would do that.
Interesting.
I love your idea, though. Old Testament quotes in blue. But we have to get past that massive barrier that is in institutional Christianity today. And, Rushdoony's Law and Liberty, I think, is helpful with that. But there's an awful lot of people that don't even want to start there. It says, no, God's law.
What about Halbrook's book?
Halbrook's book is the problem. Thank you. That's the most practical book I think I've seen, more than
Rushdoony.
Rushdoony.
To Travis's point, we don't know what the actual law says. I've listened to Law and Liberty, and it's a great book, but I don't know how much he gets into. I think, doesn't Halbrook go through?
He goes through the specifics.
Yeah.
What Halbrook does, Steve Halbrook, God is Just. That's the name of the book. God is Just, and he happens to be a personal friend of mine, and it's a great book because one of the things that he does really well is he takes on those people say, if a woman is raped, then you have to stone her. This is what's flying around out there. No, that's just a flat out lie, quite frankly. And one of the things he does is, as a practical matter, he spends a lot of time, for example, on this issue of whether or not God's law is draconian is the word, or harsh, if you will. And he compares that with man's law and makes the point, you want harsh? You want that? Let's talk about people who put, the torture, for example, that went on and on and on and goes on in pagan nations, even now, and is ignored or approved of by the same people who are calling God's law harsh.
Yeah.
It's a great resource for that.
Yeah.
And I would say, I know you didn't ask me, but for
Travis,
people,
what do you think?
For people more, yes, thanks, Chris. For people more like me who are more in the general equity theonomy type camp, Vern Poythress's book, The Shadow of Christ and the Law of Moses, is kind of a way of seeing, in the very introduction of the book or the preface or whatever, he explicitly acknowledges his indebtedness to Rushdoony and other guys, in the theonomy camp. The more saber-toothed theonomists, I guess you could say.
Saber-tooth.
But, he acknowledges that he's been, pushed and encouraged, and he's learned a lot from their writings and his friendship with a lot of those guys. But he wouldn't call himself a theonomist. However, if you go through his book, which I'm doing, at the end of the day, he always acknowledges, these things are so valuable for us as New Testament Christians. We need to wrestle with it and figure out how it applies now. Mm-hmm. He doesn't always land in the same place as Rushdoony, but he's seeking to highly elevate and value the law of God in the church. And, whether or not we all end up in the same place, I think that the goal is we need to wrestle with it. We need to know it. We need to seek to apply it.
Is Vern Poythress still alive?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Well, here's why I'd be a little bit happier with his book, which I haven't read, but I'm very familiar with it. It's an old book. It's been around for quite a while.
It's from the 90s, early 90s,
yeah.
I think.
So maybe 30 years old or whatever.
1991.
1991. Yeah. Okay. I want his next book to be The Shadow of Moses and the Law of Christ. That's what I want to hear next, because the title is still like, well, it's still Moses' law, right? Christ was in there somewhere. We need to kind of find him. And I'm like, no, it's all Christ. But he's just not quite saying that, it sounds like. Not quite all Christ. We got Mo in there.
I know you're not going to be happy with Poythress's book. However, I'm just saying for a listener who might be like, I don't know, this Rushdoony thing is a little much for me. Maybe start out with looking at somebody like a Poythress.
Baby steps here.
Start out with Luke Saint's book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy.
No, that's much shorter.
Like it's much shorter. Yeah, but it's much shorter than all these books. I'm actually reading through Poythress's book as well, and there's a lot of good points in there. Yeah. To your point that we want to understand what the law of God says. It is a good resource. Obviously, Vern Poythress is a very bright guy. I don't agree with everything he says. For example, he'll come down and say, you know what, maybe. And I actually mentioned this in my book, 7 Status Sins, where he talks about acts of homosexuality. You know what? Maybe it is right to, in some cases, this would be a capital offense. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't get there by looking at God's law. He says, well, I'm going to take this, whatever is disruptive to society, maybe then it could warrant the death penalty. And he doesn't. And then I don't know how you can't make that same argument with idolatry and transgenderism and the priestess of that religion, which is what I talk about in my book. But Poythress's book is good. I'm also working through it, and he does engage the theonomists. So it's always nice to read that. Someone who's trying to take the law seriously, engaging the theonomists. I think some things are lacking, of course. I mean, he would disagree with me for sure, but it is definitely, I think, a good book. Interesting book.
Yeah, and I value it because what I don't like is I don't like the Westminster West type mentality.
Just dismissing it. You guys
those guys all just kind of dismiss it. They came out with that book all against theonomy. People like Poythress and Frame are actually willing to engage it. And if you read in Frame's book, which I really love, The Doctrine of the Christian Life, he has a whole appendix in the back dealing with theonomy, and basically says you really need to deal with Rushdoony because he has a lot of really valuable, important things to say, and he's not just dismissing it, like a lot of the cool kids in the Reform camp do.
If you could just get people to view the law of God as the standard of justice. That's all it takes. That's a theonomist.
Right, and that's what Vern Poythress says he agrees with. And that's another...
Then that's a theonomist.
That's what I like about his book. He says, you know what, these people who critique the theonomists and say, oh, they just take everything literally, they don't understand how to interpret the Bible and grammatically, historically. He's like, no, that's false. Theonomists don't do that. And that's what I hear a lot from sometimes people say, well, you guys can't, you don't agree with each other. You take everything woodenly literal. And Poitras is like, that's not fair. He's trying to look at it and say the theonomists are right, that the law of God is a standard of justice. And I think so he does have a lot of good stuff in that book.
Yeah, and nobody said Joe Boot's book, The Mission of God, I think is a great, if you are where Travis was saying that, like, I'm not so sure if I can digest the T-bone steak of Rushdoony, if you will, and I need something that's like maybe cut up for me a little bit. The Mission of God provides a philosophical and epistemological groundwork for understanding theonomy. If you want to understand the ultimate purpose, because theonomy is often tied to postmillennialism. Okay, if we are going to challenge the world and improve the world and go out into the world and bring the world to Christ and make disciples of all nations, by what standard are we going to use? Theonomy is often tied to postmillennialism, and postmillennialism is often tied to theonomy, and that's tied to Calvinism and all that kind of stuff. But The Mission of God by Joe Boot is a great resource for understanding all three of those things. So I recommend that.
Is Ruler of Kings a shortened version of that?
I don't know. I haven't read Ruler of Kings.
I've read Ruler of Kings. I would say it is.
Yeah, I think there's kind of like two separate things there, and the books that I was trying to point out to Travis's point were ones that really get into here's what the Old Testament law says specifically. I mean, obviously you can just read the Bible, but they then provide some commentary. I mean, even James Jordan's book, The Law of the Covenant, Halberg's book, Rushdoony's Institutes, is a little of both, saying, hey, here's the philosophy, here's the application. I would say your book, Luke, is also a little both, and is also unique in the sense it's trying to apply the structure. So
yes.
we need to understand, Travis was saying, what does the law say? Because so much of this is people are reacting to something that they don't even know. They're saying, oh, you guys believe in God's law. That must mean X.
Yes.
And a lot of times in your book, you're pointing out, no, that's not what it means. You've assumed these things based on your statist mindset.
Yes.
Yeah, well, this would be a good time to say that a lot of the folks, I wouldn't say all, but a lot of the folks that attack theonomy are just flat out misrepresenting and frankly frauds. Because what they'll say is this, you'll see this all the time, they want to apply the law of Moses. No, we don't apply the law of just the law. We don't apply all of God's law word to all of life. But what they do is they characterize us, say, well, you slam us with the law of Moses. And of course, all people can see is like, what, sacrificing bulls again. Mm-hmm. And that's just not, it's just flat out not true, which tells you that their position is extremely weak and tenuous. If your position is always weak and tenuous, if to make your point, you have to misrepresent the other side.
Right.
Yeah, and that's I think it's a Rushdoony term, the law word, right?
Yeah.
That's the only place I've really seen it.
Yeah.
If he didn't invent it, he popularized it.
Yeah.
So, but the idea, like, when you look at the Old Testament, and the Jews would refer to basically all of the first 5 books and even more as the law. So law is a very broad term. It covers narrative. Like there's all different aspects to it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I believe what Christ even said is a law in the law it is written, and then quotes Isaiah, I believe, in one point.
So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I don't remember that reference, but the point being, law is not just do this or this will happen to you. It when we refer to the law of God, it's referring, like you said, to the entirety of God's word. Really is our instruction in what is, as 2 Timothy 3:16, it's for all of life. It applies to everything.
If you want to hear an objection to theonomy, this was shared in a Facebook group. I'm trying to find the source of the quote, but apparently it's written by an amillennial guy. And the quote is this: the problem of the modern theonomist is that he mislocates the Christian. Our present sojourn is in Babylon and not Jerusalem. Daniel was not called to Hebrew nationalized Babylon in his temporary sojourn as if Babylon should become the new Jerusalem. Daniel worked within the Babylonian system to remain loyal to Christ, to worship his king, and to patiently wait during an appointed 70 years until the exiles were brought home and the kingdom was restored in its fullness. So, too, the church waits during her time of exile for Christ to physically return and bring our present earthly sojourn to an end. Then the new Jerusalem will descend to us, and the kingdom of God will come in all of its fullness and glory. For the present, we look much more like Daniel under Nebuchadnezzar than Israel under her geopolitical kings. Translation, just wait till Christ comes back. He'll fix everything. Until then, seek first your own kingdom and your righteousness.
Yeah, but see, there's such frauds, though, because what he's going to say, well, as long as my property is secure, as long as I get to watch my Monday night football game, what happens when that goes? Is he going to have the same attitude when he's being dragged off to Babylon on the way? Mm-hmm. Well, maybe he might have a little bit different view of things, but that's the testimony of a guy who's comfortable, who the pagans are leaving him alone enough, and giving him enough peace and enough bread and circuses in the meantime. But bro, that's not the case for everybody.
The guys in the January 6th, I mean, they can't afford to say something like that.
No, they can't. And most
they can't afford to have that theological position.
And people, and a place where people are being persecuted. You say, okay, you know what? Rape my wife and kids, sell them into slavery, burn down my house, drag me off into some sort of gulag someplace.
Yeah.
The only solution is wait for the return of Christ. That's what he said. But then why, if that's the only solution, then why do we have all this instruction in the law word of God about how we're supposed to live? He has, a guy like that has a problem with the law word of God because it does tell us how to live, and he'd rather ignore it. What a wicked man, frankly. That's wicked.
1 Corinthians 14, Joel, is where Paul says, "In the law is written, by people of strange tongues and by the lips of foreigners will I speak to this people. And even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord."
Right.
So paraphrasing from Isaiah.
Quoting Isaiah. Calling it the law to that point. Yeah.
Say 1 Corinthians.
1 Corinthians 14:21. I want to wrap up this law thing because we kind of got, and this is good discussion from Thomas Paine's point. So Thomas Paine says, this is kind of, in America, he says, the law is king. I mean, this is kind of the force of his argument here in chapter 3, that there's only one king in this land, and it's not the king of England, it's the law. He says, for as in absolute governments, the king is law, so in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. That was, to what I was saying, okay, what law? Because in the end, if it's not God's law, it's going to be man's law. And this is where I said, what's the substance to this? I mean, what is Paine actually arguing for here? He's just arguing, and we hear this all the time. Well, in America, we're a nation of laws. Well, okay, well, what does, if the laws are wicked, how is that a good thing? Right? We're a nation of man-made laws. Okay, and that's in the end because Paine does not go to God's law in any sense. I mean, he uses the Bible to kind of make his appeal to the fact that we shouldn't have a king, but there is no, he's not going to the law of God. So that's kind of why we started on this. And any other brief comments on that about Paine? And then also, real quick, he says a government of our own is our natural right. I think we talked about this 2 weeks ago, but that's wrong. It's not our natural right to have a just government. It's our duty to enforce justice. And this whole Enlightenment thinking of, well, this is our natural right. We're born, free, or we're innocent, and if you put us in a state of, it's our right. No, what we deserve is wrath and damnation. It's our duty to enforce justice, and that mindset is, I think, absent from most of these Enlightenment thinkers. But any other comments? I want to briefly get to the Gerald Groff thing, but any other comments on Paine's use of, he really makes an argument here, well, the law is king, but what is he talking about? So let me start with you, Joel. Final thoughts on Paine here on those 2 points.
He's kicking the can down the road, as all natural law theorists have to do. They must do it. The King of England stinks, let's make up our own laws. But going back again, how do we know, absent the Bible, how do we know that what we do is going to be more just, or maybe in Paine?
Because
for Paine,
60% of the representatives vote for it.
Yeah, there you go. So that means we have justice, right?
The Sturdy Act.
Yeah, Sturdy Act. Talk about that crazy idea. Yeah, make sure you nail down your That's so maddening.
That's the fruit of ultimate, in a sense, it's a fruit of what he's arguing. It wasn't just
well,
him.
it is, and it's statism too, which we have such a problem with. And people wonder, what is statism? The Sturdy Act is statism because it assumes that the state is more concerned with your children than you are. If it wouldn't be for the state, why, my goodness, you'd probably be piling the furniture on the kids yourself because you hate them that much. Meanwhile, you are fine with killing the babies in the womb. Talking about the Sturdy Act, not too sturdy in the womb for you, Senator, forget your name.
Bob Casey.
Bob Casey.
He's still around.
Yeah. He's
How old is that guy?
he's been around for a while. He's probably about effective as our other cadaver that we have in the
you
Senate
might be
here. What's his
thinking of
name?
His dad.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah. What was it? I always forget the other dude's name. The
Toomey?
no. The guy
No,
we got now.
President Biden?
Frankenstein guy.
What's the
Fetterman.
dude? Fetterman.
Fetterman,
Yeah. Fetterman and Casey about as effective as each other. Point being here is you can only kick the can down the road, and that's what Paine does. King of England's laws stink. We'll make up our own. What are you going to do when your own stink?
Like this one.
Yeah, like this one.
Yeah. Sturdy Act, that didn't come from a King of England, right? Came from our own guy.
Right. Luke, natural rights, natural law, the law is king in America. I think the Enlightenment idea of, we're free in our natural state, but biblically we're not, we're born in sin. We're born under damnation. And if you leave it to ourselves, we won't be able to figure it out because we're in rebellion against Christ. So I think that's one of the fundamental errors of Enlightenment thinking is it does not recognize Christ as Savior. We don't need a Savior. We'll figure it out on our own.
Yeah.
But we don't just need a Savior spiritually. We need a Savior socially, like according to justice. We can't figure out justice on our own without Christ. So your final thoughts on Paine?
The problem with the claim that the law is king, that's a claim that the Bible never makes. The Bible never makes that claim. The Israelites, when they rejected God, he didn't say they've rejected my law. They said they've rejected me, that I should rule over them. So God, I believe, is always, his plan is for every nation to recognize him as king, to recognize Christ as king. That's the king.
Your basic churchman would argue with you on that point.
Yes, they would.
No, that was just for Israel. That was just for them.
That was just for Israel.
Like God isn't, like Christ is not king over the nations.
Right. And to prove what I'm saying here, whenever people who are in charge of your government are using the Bible to point out the problems, but are not using the Bible to establish the solutions.
Right, that's Paine.
That's Paine. He often goes to the Bible to point out the problem, but he doesn't go to the Bible to say, here's what the Bible has to say about how we fix this problem. But reading Romans chapter 1, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the nations. That's what Paul's trying to do. He's trying to bring about the obedience of faith among all the nations. And, he's not trying to put the law as king. He's trying to put Christ as king among all the nations. That's a claim in Revelation. That's a claim throughout all the Old Testament. Christ is king. He's our lawgiver. And when Paine goes to the Bible to say, here's a problem, the king is violating our rights, the king doesn't know what he's doing, and the Bible has to say this about that. But then he goes to complete statism to say, here's the solution. We make our own government, we make our own laws, and then we're back to square one again, because the problem was never the office of the king. The problem was always the power and authority given to the king outside of the Scriptures. The Bible never gives anyone the authority to legislate outside of God's law. That's the problem.
So, and I'll come to you, Travis, in a second here. And that's kind of the point. I mean, if you read Paine's Common Sense, the whole thing, I mean, his argument is very clear that we need to be able to make our own laws, and that law is what's king. Mm-hmm. I mean, it'd be one thing if he was saying the law of God is king, you'd still have your point there. But he's not even saying that. He's clearly saying that whatever laws we make is king. Yes. I mean, there's no way around that. And I wanted to read real quick, because I mentioned last time, and this kind of goes, I mean, it's a simple proposition that if you need to recognize Christ as your Lord and and king of your state, of your society. And we talked about this last time, but I have the actual quote here. So this is from Benjamin F. Morris. He said, "It is said that after the convention had adjourned," this is the Constitutional Convention, "Reverend Dr. Miller, a distinguished professor in Princeton College, met Alexander Hamilton in the streets of Philadelphia and said, 'Mr. Hamilton, we are greatly grieved that the Constitution has no recognition of God or the Christian religion.' To which Hamilton responded, 'I declare we forgot it.'" Now, later, Morris says that Washington becomes president, and a Presbyterian in New England sent an address to President George Washington and said, "We should not have been alone in rejoicing to have seen some explicit acknowledgement of the only true God and Jesus Christ whom he has sent inserted somewhere in the Magna Carta of our country." And here's what Washington replied. "I am persuaded you will permit me to observe that the path of true piety is so plain as to require but little political direction. To this consideration we ought to ascribe the absence of any regulation respecting religion from the Magna Carta of our country. To the guidance of the ministers of the gospel, this important object is perhaps more properly committed, and in the progress of morality and science, to which our government will give every furtherance, we may confidently expect the advancement of true religion and the completion of our happiness." So basically,
That hasn't aged well. Has not aged well.
We do not need to recognize Christ because you know what? That's not really what our government. That's important. We need the right religion, but we don't need to recognize him. So. Well, we see where that's gotten us. Travis, your final thoughts on Thomas Paine? I don't know if you're able to read his parts of his Common Sense or what you thought of his Law as King and all that, and then we'll move on.
I mean, just this Washington quote here. I think Washington is acknowledging that really the people of God, the church, the ministers of the gospel should be at the forefront. I think is what he's saying here.
He's saying that,
and I would agree with you that there should be some explicit acknowledgement of Christ in our nation's constitution, whatever, Magna Carta. And I've said before, I think that's like the Achilles heel of the whole thing is that it's not explicitly acknowledging Christ as king and submitting to his word as the final authority and standard. But I think that Washington, if I'm reading him correctly here, I think he's onto something. Really, at the end of the day, what does God say? He says, if my people will repent and turn, acknowledge me, then I will heal their land. So the most important thing for us in our generation is for the church to...
Time to wake up, Luke.
Yeah. Time to get out of bed.
Happens every podcast, man. It always gets me.
But I think I think Washington's onto something there, that the ministers of the gospel need to be at the forefront of this in leading the nation, leading the people. That was what, the American War for Independence in many ways was led by the ministers of the gospel.
Well, he's right about that, but I guess the point being that they should have, and some of these ministers of the gospel were saying, you've buried the lead here, you've missed the main point. You've failed to acknowledge Christ.
Right. And they should have kept at it.
Well, yeah, they were doing what Washington maybe was telling them to do. And he's like, we don't need that.
But not here. Do
right,
it. And
right.
It almost sounds like do it in your churches, but not here. It kind of sounds.
And that might be the case. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, they should have kept at it. I mean, if that generation and the following generation had faithfully done that, maybe we'd be in a different position now, but maybe they got too comfy with the way things were.
And some of them did. If you look at it, there was, I forget what's called the National Reform or
NRA, the other NRA.
Yeah, that was around.
That
goes way back.
Yeah, it does.
And they were trying to revise the Constitution. So some did, but yeah, I mean, generally Reformed theology started to wane. I mean, I just read last night that it was like 80% Reformed theology at the time of the founding, but that slowly waned. By the time you get to the Civil War, it's way down. And this guy said the resurgence really started in like the 1960s and 70s. So anyway, Thomas Paine, a lot there. Hopefully, if you listen to the two previous episodes and this one, you'll get a bit of an idea of Thomas Paine's common sense, hopefully from a biblical perspective. That's what we've at least tried to do. It's an interesting read. It's certainly something that you should read for if you're going to study American history. You want to read Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Your kids should read it and understand what he's saying there and understand the arguments that he's making in context at the time. And he's arguing ultimately for man-made law. Which leads us, we've already talked about it briefly with this Sturdy Act, but I want us to go. We have a few minutes left here before Luke has to leave. I want us to talk about Title VII, okay, the Civil Rights Act. All right, let me just introduce this story. Okay, this is a Lancaster County man named Gerald Groff. Okay, and his case went to the Supreme Court. I believe it was April. Yeah, it was argued on April 18th. Luke, were you able to listen to the arguments?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I listened to him as well. Anybody else listen to him?
I did not.
No, I didn't listen to the argument.
Okay. So let me just read. This is from the syllabus of the Supreme Court. It says, Petitioner Gerald Groff is an evangelical Christian who believes for religious reasons that Sunday should be devoted to worship and rest. In 2012, Groff took a mail delivery job with the United States Postal Service. Groff's position generally did not involve Sunday work, but that changed after USPS agreed to begin facilitating Sunday deliveries for Amazon. To avoid the requirement to work Sundays on a rotating basis, Groff transferred to a rural USPS station and did not make Sunday deliveries. After Amazon deliveries began at that station as well, Groff remained unwilling to work Sundays, and USPS redistributed Groff's Sunday deliveries to other USPS staff. Groff received progressive discipline for failing to work on Sundays, and he eventually resigned. Groff sued under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, asserting that USPS could have accommodated his Sunday Sabbath practice without, quote, undue hardship on the conduct of the USPS's business. Okay, so his case went up, the chain of courts, basically ruling against him each time. He gets to the Supreme Court. They don't actually rule fully in his favor. They remand the case, so they send it back to the lower courts. But what they say is, the other courts ruled with this understanding that it was just a de minimis. If your religious request is even in the most minimal way causes your employer to a hardship, then they don't have to grant it. And the Supreme Court said, well, it's got to be a little bit more than that. It needs to be substantial. So Gerald Groff and his team was like, hey, this was a big win for us, because now when we think these lower courts hear it, they're going to say, you know what? It wasn't that substantial of a burden on USPS, whereas USPS says, we still think we're going to win this thing. I mean, this was not just a minimal thing. We had to, there's morale issues. We had to rotate shifts. We had to find people to work. So all these things. So that's a brief overview of the case. A real quick, Title VII. Again, this is a man-made law here, so I do want to talk about this. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it unlawful for covered employees to fail or refuse to hire or discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation terms, conditions, or privileges, employment because of such individual's religion. But there's actually much more. Let me find it here. It's based on race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, and national origin. So those are the things covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is a case of a man who didn't want to work on the Lord's Day. Commend him for that. But what do we make of this case and the law, the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, the law? Luke, let me start with you. You listened to the arguments. What was your initial reaction to Gerald Groff's case there?
Well, the arguments. I mean, the standard. The standard is what everyone else said. They keep appealing to other cases. Well, in this case, you guys said this, and in this case, you guys said that, and in this case, this judge ruled this, and in this case, this law was passed, and it was like this convoluted argument. It seemed to be that there was three people arguing, that it was the lawyer versus the Supreme Court versus an invisible party, which was Congress. They kept arguing with Congress without Congress being there.
Right.
It was weird in that way. Like, well, Congress said this
in these oral arguments.
In these oral arguments. Well, Congress has said this, and Congress said that. It's so convoluted that you're so far away from justice that you have to swim in this ocean of what everyone else said and what everyone else did, and you have to kind of use that as your authority. Well, you said this here, so that means I get to get X. That was the opening argument.
Let's start with the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yeah.
Is that a good law?
No, of course not. And
why not? Because people are going to say, "What? You guys believe in discrimination?"
Here's why. Because it might be there are many times when it is immoral to discriminate against somebody for a reason, but it should never be illegal. If you want to say, "I don't want to hire anybody who has blue eyes," that should be your right. It's your business. You do not move the boundary stone of your neighbor. That's his business. That's his right. If he says, if you own a Chinese restaurant and you say, I want to have Chinese workers, that should be your right. When I would,
Or Mexican workers,
or
like a lot of them.
Yeah. Who cares?
Yeah.
Who cares? Listen, if
Or Italian
if,
restaurants.
But I'm
Mexican
like that.
workers.
I mean, if I go to a Chinese restaurant, I want to see Chinese employees. I do.
Right.
I don't trust them if they don't have Chinese employees.
Right.
It's not a Chinese restaurant.
Right. If there's people other than Chinese origin or Asian descent walking around in the restaurant serving me food, I'm like, is this even a real Chinese restaurant? You know, but I mean, but that's fine. So because there are many places I've been to that there's not Chinese people working there, and the food's fine. That's fine. But you know, it should be your right to refuse to hire anybody for whatever reason you want. And you know, people say, well, then I mean, no one will be hired. And well, then that's not true. But you know, the argument is really this: it's not whether, I mean, that's a false flag to say, well, you know, it's about discrimination. No, that's the real problem is you've given the government the authority over something that they should not have authority over. They do not have authority to tell businesses to who and when and how to hire people. That is not under their purview. It's not under their responsibility to tell people who. I mean, it ultimately comes down to the government telling you how to do your business. That's what it is. That's what these civil rights acts do. Now, it is a good thing to not discriminate based on race. Of course, we have that right now. The government obviously thinks it's okay to discriminate based on race. Affirmative action, that's what it does.
The White House press secretary.
White House press. I mean, they all discriminate based on race. I mean, for affirmative action is discrimination based on race. So don't give me this. Oh no. We shouldn't be discriminating based on race. We have it right now. It's happening. Obviously, the government thinks it's okay to discriminate based on race. They're completely fine with it. So don't give me this, if without the Civil Rights Act, we'd be discriminating based on race. We're discriminating based on race right now. The government is openly hostile to people of white descent. They're openly hostile. Affirmative action is openly hostile against people of white descent. So the real problem is we've given the government the authority to tell us how to do our business. That is not under their responsibility. Their responsibility is to establish and facilitate justice. That's it.
Yeah, and this is an example again of what happens when you give man the power. Law is king in America, so this law is king. And so when you have these oral arguments, it's always going back to, okay, this is the standard. I want to bring everybody else into this, but there's so many layers to this. And I don't want to get too much into the fact that the U.S. government shouldn't be involved in the mail system. I mean, their business is. They even mentioned it in the oral arguments how they're underwater. I mean, they're not making any money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is the post office established by the federal government?
It's run.
So Groff has a case. I believe he has a case because in the contract, because we do believe in contract between employer and employee. The Congress shall not make a law that
regarding an establishment of religion
or the free exercise thereof. Right. So if it comes down to the oral agreement or the contractual agreement, he took that job with the understanding that the government cannot get in the way of his free exercise of his faith. Observing the Sabbath is his free exercise of his faith. And if he took the job with that understanding, his case, I'm on his side, that the government said, we're not going to make a law that discriminates against your free exercise of faith. And here they are doing it. And they're saying that we can do this. But actually, according to the agreement between him and the United States government, they are not allowed to discriminate against his free exercise of faith. Now, that's their word. I'm holding them to their promise. So his case is a legitimate case.
Well, he didn't. But he sued under Title VII.
Right, and that's the wrong thing to sue under.
He sued under the Civil Rights Act. Right. I mean, I think the First Amendment. We could get into that. There's so much to get into here.
Right. I'm not saying the First Amendment is because actually is legitimate, but I'm just saying that if we're going to go off of here's what the employer and the employee agreed to, the employer is violating their word, and they're now not allowing him to exercise his religion freely. That's their standard. I didn't say that's the right standard. I'm just saying that's their standard that they agreed to when they hired him.
Yeah, and that does bring us into the religious freedom thing, which I do want to talk about as well. Yeah, first of all, I mean, the USPS shouldn't be in the mail business. I mean, there are other delivery companies that are not losing money. and they're not run by the government. So
Yeah, if I could address that a little bit, having worked for FedEx at one time, years and years ago, and found out all these things that FedEx was not allowed to do to protect the government's USP, United Parcel Service
really?
business. Oh, yeah. Yeah, crazy stuff. For example, I remember some of this stuff. Like if you were non-USPS, you were only allowed to transport freight in certain size jets. And Fred Smith, who owned Federal Express at the time, CEO of FedEx at the time, had to go to Congress to get Congress to change the law to allow them to transport freight in DC-10s. You remember the DC, some of you older folks remember before we had Boeing 740 and 760, this and that. It was DC-7s, DC-8, right? And so, and the law was in place to protect the United USPS. Another law in place was, for example, the folks from Lancaster County will appreciate this. If back in the day, if FedEx picks up a package in their Lancaster station that was going, say, from Quarryville to Lidditz, for example, and the FedEx station handled both, you had to have that package cross state lines. This was law, right? It had to leave and now can get lost or whatever, right? You were not allowed to keep it in your station overnight. This is the nonsense. There's other nonsense too that's out there just to protect the USPS. So of course, once you have the power of the federal government behind you, you can make stupid laws like that, whereas private people can't. And no wonder it costs us, what, 60, 70 cents to send what's it called? I don't even know.
Not enough, apparently.
Not enough because they're still underwater.
Yeah, they should charge us $5 a stamp by now.
Yeah. Turn us loose. Let people compete. I remember reading this about this a while ago, where somebody got the idea to just distribute letters and correspondence on Capitol Hill, and they were charging like almost nothing. It was just Capitol Hill right there, right? And it was a lot cheaper, and the business was going good. Until somebody got a hold of it from the USPS. Now you're breaking the law here. Right. And that was the end of that. No, you got to pay our rates.
So at 66 cents is the current stamp price.
66 cents.
What's the cost to mail a letter through like UPS or FedEx?
It's more expensive than that.
Right, but that's probably more of an accurate...
But what if they
accurate
could
description
compete?
Right. That's accurate representation of how much it costs.
Yeah, right. The actual cost, yeah. And I've heard someone say that, well, USPS is not a business, it's a service. So obviously it has to be underwater because it's a service. It's not a business.
Yeah, it's always underwater. But here's the thing. If you were to turn UPS loose, Federal Express and all these other delivery companies, I have no doubt in my mind that if you were sending local mail, that it'd be far cheaper. What the USPS says is, well, if you live in outer Alaska or whatever, it costs more, but we have to spread that cost out. Yeah, now we're back to spreading the cost out. You know what? If you want to live in, on the Alaska highway someplace, it should cost you more to get your mail.
Yeah, you're crazy.
Yeah,
yeah.
Right.
How do you want to live up there?
Yeah, you live up there. Yeah, that's part.
That's your punishment.
Why should I pay 66 cents to send a note to my neighbor to support you living out in the tundra someplace?
All right, so that's part of this religious freedom, because if you listen to this argument, I mean, it applies to any religion, right? That's the thing here that I think we do appreciate.
Good point.
Groff's desire to rest on the Lord's Day. There's a lot. I don't know if we're even going to get into it completely today, but there's a lot there. I mean, there's so much there to consider. Also regarding, if you have an employer who is providing, works of mercy and necessity. I mean, we could get into all that. But the point is, the Title VII and religious freedom applies to any religion. So this is, I think, one of the fundamental flaws when Christians say religious freedom is a good thing. No, it's not, because it basically says, okay, the Christian religion is just like every other religion down here, and the state is ultimately supreme. You can have your religious observances, your accommodations for any religion equally, but the state is ultimately the ultimate standard. And so, you argue here, if you...
Would you say the state is saying that they're the arbiter of what a legitimate religion is?
They're definitely the arbiter of what religious practice they will allow.
Okay.
At the end of the day, it always comes back to, the compelling state interest here. If the government has a reason to limit that exercise, then they will. But if you
Wow,
follow if you follow Title VII, if you apply Title VII in religious freedom, you would have Christian employers forced to honor pagan religions. That's the point. And Christians don't understand that. They think, we want religious freedom. No, we don't. We want Christian religion. Right. And within that, there is a small category for your pagan religions, even under a theonomic system. But religious freedom is not what Christians should be arguing for. So, Travis, what are your thoughts on the Groff situation?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, basically, I'm fully supportive of what Groff was doing there. I think that that's just another area where the church has disregarded God's law. Most Christians, if you talk to them in Lancaster County, really don't think the fourth commandment still applies to us. The whole idea of the Sabbath being honored and observed is it's the 1/10 of the 10 commandments that doesn't still apply.
It's the 9 commandments, the one suggestion.
Yes,
Yeah, well,
exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that is it's a problem, because as soon as that is not a binding law on us anymore, then you get really wishy-washy on things. You get churches that are saying, oh, well, maybe we could just start having services anytime we want throughout the week. And then you have situations like the Groff situation, where as a society, we need to get to a place where there is a sacred day of worship.
Yeah.
And you only get there if the Christian religion is the religion of the society, because otherwise I can make up my own religion, and 3 days a week are my Sabbath, and you have to honor that as the employer.
Right. That's definitely part of it, because they were not arguing for the fourth commandment. That would have been one thing if it was like, we're going to look to God's law. Should Gerald Groff be required to work on the Lord's Day? That was not the argument at all. It was not about that. So again, it goes back to like, well, do you try to use this system to get? I really don't know if this was a worthwhile thing. I mean, for example, I'm with you 100%, and I think, and Luke, you have a short chapter on the Sabbath in your book.
Yeah.
But I mean, let's say, for example, we have a tow truck company, right? Because maybe we need to get into this a little bit, where they're going to say we're going to offer our services on Sunday, in case someone breaks down. And whatever they need to get their car towed, or some other service. So we could look at all those things and say, well, is that guy violating the fourth commandment? I don't think so. I don't think he is taking the law of God in its totality. I think that's kind of one of your arguments, at least in your book, somewhat. So if that's the case, should that tow truck company be allowed to hire and fire whoever he wants? And if he says, look, one of the things we do here is we provide service to people on the Lord's Day, and yeah, we get paid for it, because otherwise we're not going to be able to do it. That's what you and I talked about in the one after show. Should that tow truck company be allowed to say, what, I'm not going to hire you if you're not at least available to do this on a rotation basis? I think he should be allowed to do that, right? And I think the employee should be free to say, well, you know what? My conscience says that we shouldn't even be helping people on the side of the road on the Lord's Day as a business, and therefore I can't work for you. Fine, don't work for him. So I think that's the Christian thing we got to bring in. Like, I get Gerald Groff's point. I mean, I've been in positions where I was like, I wish I didn't have to work on the Lord's Day, but I didn't sue under Title VII. So, Joel, what do you think about that as a pastor? Like, I agree with you, Travis. I think the problem there a lot of times is with the church and the individuals. So I want to get your guys' thoughts on this. And we might have to revisit this another time as well. Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, if we get to the quote-unquote the right answer on the wrong basis, we're ultimately going to have our foundation crumble underneath us. And we're going to get to the wrong answer eventually. We will. If it's on Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground truly is sinking sand, then let's sue on the basis of God's law and lose, rather than sue on the basis of Title VII
And win.
and win.
Yeah, now you got to honor all the Muslim.
Absolutely.
You got to follow all that stuff.
Yeah.
Sure you do. And so now we have what? Okay, a Muslim woman wants to cover her face for her driver's license photo, right? Got to honor it. Well, that makes a hang of a lot of sense.
Again, that would be a moot point because we shouldn't have driver's license.
Yeah.
But to
Another
your point,
would be.
to your
It would
point,
be.
the Christian businesses, once they get to a certain size, theoretically are going to have to follow all these. And then they have all these loopholes and stuff. Well, if you're a Christian, you say you're a Christian company, then, maybe it's okay to discriminate based on the basis of religion. It's all this nonsense, all these loopholes.
Yes.
It just never ends.
Yeah, on Christ a solid rock, I stand. The Bible. Yes, I stand alone on the Word of God. Right? No. We have to stand on Title 7. Driving in today, right? A van passed me. Might have passed you as well, Luke. This heating and air conditioning company advertises 1 hour response. Now, did you see that?
No.
Okay, on the way in. Anyway, because I'm thinking 1 hour response, and they're just call. I mean, it's really pretty good marketing. Dial 1-800-1-HOUR. That's pretty stinking good. Mm-hmm. Okay. To your point, Chris, on Sunday, right? And I said, well, hey, you know what? I'm going to work for this company, but I'm not working on Sunday. Well, then we can't advertise 1 hour then, right? Well, then don't work for them. No, let's go Supreme Court. Let's do stand on Title 7 rather than on the actual Word of God. And know that when you actually took the job.
Yeah. So there's another case briefly in Ocean Grove, New Jersey that I sent to you guys. And that town is owned, if you will, by the Methodist Camp Association.
Yes.
They got it back in the 1860s, and it's been their practice to keep the beach closed on the Lord's Day.
Yes.
And they've changed it recently to say, well, we're just going to keep it closed in the morning. Okay, and I think they're free to do either one. Now, that's a case where I would be totally supportive of them being like this, because now the state's coming in and saying like, you can't do this.
Right.
And they're like, well, this is our private property. I don't know all the details, but they're definitely claiming, look, this is our private property. We have the right to keep it closed on the Lord's Day. And our argument is it's not Title 7. It's we want to honor God here. And I know that's what Groff is saying. I understand that personally, but then he's suing under Title 7. So that's a case where, okay, if you had just judges, they would say, no, the state obviously wouldn't exist to this extent. They can't come in here and force you to open on the Lord's Day. But ultimately, with most of this stuff, I mean, the state just shouldn't be involved. And Luke, just comment briefly,
What an example of colonialism that whole case is. It's such a, I mean, these people are like anti-colonialism. I know it's not
the Ocean Grove case?
The Ocean Grove case.
Yeah.
It's not the locals who are making a problem about this. The guy said in the article, like, everyone around here is fine. They know it's closed on Sunday morning. They're completely fine with this being closed on Sunday morning. It's people from out of town, people who are not from here, who are coming in and being like, you should be open. It's such an example of these people who are like, I'm deconstructing my colonialism, but then they come into other places and try to bring their colonialism in and force people to go against their conscience. It's so wicked and wrong. And if separation of church and state, they don't believe in that either. They're saying you should be open. You have a moral responsibility to be open, because if it's not moral, then it doesn't matter. If this is not a moral case, then it really doesn't matter at the end of the day whether open or closed. But they are saying it's moral. It's immoral for you to be closed because I want to have my vacation and blah, 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 blah. And I don't even know if it's about that. I think it's just about pushing people around. That's what I think it's about.
Yeah, that's what the president of that camp association said, at least. They're targeting us because we're Christians.
Yes.
If we were another group and we were closed, Wednesday morning, nobody would care.
Oh, yeah. If they've said we're a Muslim group and we want to close that, it wouldn't touch them. Not with a 10-foot pole.
Right. So, yeah, I'm agreeing with you, Travis, that we need to take seriously the fourth commandment. But I guess I'm also looking at it and saying, okay, well, what does actually the law of God then grant the civil government the authority to do as it relates to that? And it's one of the points in your book, Luke. Well, how is a judge going to adjudicate between someone over the Sabbath day when there's certainly a matter of conscience there? And yes. Jesus has said, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So I think you're right, Travis, that we as a society, as a church, we need to come back to saying we need to honor the Lord's Day and set it apart. And that's only going to happen if there's a change from within. But to appeal to the government under the auspices of Title VII and religious freedom, I've argued before that when you argue for religious freedom, you open the door for these abortionists in New Mexico to say religious freedom gives us the right to practice abortion. Mm-hmm. And I argue that they're actually right. Mm-hmm. If you adopt the religious freedom argument, which is not Christ is Lord, the state is Lord, all the other religions are free to exist, as long as they don't infringe on our authority as the state. And you can make a case, well, abortion should be allowed if it goes against even this state law. I mean, there are other states that allow it. This is my religion. So religious freedom, Civil Rights Act is bad. Yeah, I think we've covered that. Final thoughts on this, Travis, and then we'll go around and we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, I agree with you there that the idea of freedom of religion just generically talked about is a big problem. And that comes back to something that I like to bring up all the time. This idea of neutrality is the problem. Mm-hmm. You know, like Bonson talks about push the antithesis. There's no neutrality here. There's a God. Mm-hmm. Somebody's going to be on the throne. Who is it? Is it the state? Is it some other religion? Or is it Christ? Mm-hmm. And if all you have is generic freedom of religion, it's going to be Pandora's box, and we're going to have all these vying religions. There's going to be no end to religions being created or conjured up from people, and they can make their own holy days. They can make their own rules and regulations, and basically the state's going to have to protect all of them.
Yeah, and that's what they're doing. And that was the oral arguments. Well, we can't discriminate against the Muslim religion or the whatever religion, Christian Science. Mm-hmm. They're all equal. Mm-hmm. And now it's just a matter of state interest and employer interest. And so I understand, Groff and his team say, well, this is a big win. I don't think it is. To your point, Joel, it's a faulty foundation, and you've just made it that much harder for a Christian employee to honor the Lord.
Well, you're strengthening the faulty foundation, which is the last thing you want to do.
Right.
Yeah, look, we got a good result from this. From suing on the basis of Title VII, so obviously it's a good thing.
I don't even think they're going to win. I agree with USPS. Like under their standard and systems, I don't think Groff will win when they remand it, send it back. The lower court's going to look at it again, and I think they're going to say this was more than a de minimis hardship
which is all they have to do.
They have to say it was substantial. It was undue hardship. Yeah. I don't think he's going to win. Luke, final thoughts?
We're back to Rome again. This is Rome. Freedom of religion is the same thing as it's understood today. Freedom of religion is the same thing as Rome. Okay, you can have your own religion, just say Kaiser Kurios and sprinkle, and that's all you got to do. I just want to briefly say, when it comes to law enforcement, for the Supreme Court and for Congress and for the president, I believe that there's a triune nature to law enforcement. I was talking to Dad about this yesterday, but for a law to be enforced, it must meet three criteria. It must be, first, transcendent, it must be good, and it must be knowable. If it's not transcendent, then it comes down to the opinion of an individual or a group of people. That's not good enough to force. You cannot force the opinion of a group of people onto one person, and you cannot force the opinion of one person onto a group of people. That's wickedness. So it must come from outside man's opinion. It must come from something superior to mankind. Secondly, it must be good. There are many laws out there that they're just not good laws. We need a standard to judge. Okay, is this a good law or is this a bad law? Civil Rights Act. It's yeah, right. And they say it's a law, but it's not good. The law must be good. We cannot be enforcing bad laws on people. And third, it must be knowable. You got to know what it is. It can't be general. It can't be vague like most of our laws today. The language is vague on purpose, so it can be manipulated. So for a law to be enforced, it must be transcendent. It must come from God. Secondly, it must be good, and it must be knowable. And that is a just law. That's what constitutes a law that is just. It meets these three criteria. Outside of that, we cannot understand or know how to enforce a law, because then it comes down to someone's opinion, it comes down to wickedness, and it comes down to confusion.
Yeah, well said.
Did you get that from somewhere?
No.
Oh, you guys came up with that one, huh?
I came up with that one just a couple days ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
I actually argued with him a little bit. I said you actually have to have doable in there. I wanted to exchange doable. What did I want to exchange that for?
With good.
With good. Yeah, transcendent, good, and knowable. I wanted to say it's already good if it's transcendent, so we have to have doable in there. So we got into a little argument about that. But anyway.
It's a work in progress.
Yeah.
Right. Well, my rejoinder was that, there are laws that meet two of these criteria, but we should not enforce them. So an example of something that is transcendent and good but is not knowable is God's thoughts. All right? That's transcendent and it's good, but we don't know what God's thoughts are. So we can't
Other than what
enforce
he's
them.
told us.
Other
Yeah.
than what he's told
Right,
us.
right.
An example of something that is good and knowable, but is not transcendent, might be building codes. Right. I mean, some building codes are designed to keep people safe, and I understand that, but it's not transcendent. It's just man's opinion, so you can't enforce it. You should not enforce it. And then some of them are some of them are transcendent and knowable, but they're not good. And that would be the Old Testament ceremonial laws. They're transcendent, they're knowable, but if we start sacrificing again, that's not good. So my rejoinder was that a knowable is doable, in my opinion. So anyway.
Okay. Did I ask you your final thoughts already, Joel? Because we got to wrap up.
No.
What are your final thoughts?
Just try to keep it short here. People wonder what statism is, right? How do I know if I'm a statist? Here's one way you know.
You might know you're a statist if.
Yeah. You might be a statist if you believe that it's a human right to swim at Ocean Grove on a Sunday. You might be a statist because there's once, and here's what I'm saying. Once you begin to define human right outside of the scriptures, there's no limit. And you are in idolatry now.
Right.
And the idol is ultimately going to consume your children. That's what all idols ultimately do is consume your children. You might be a statist if you're trying to define a human right outside of the scriptures.
We need to do a whole episode on you might be a statist if. List of
That's gonna be a long episode.
You might be a statist if you want the government to force businesses to honor every religion.
You might be a statist.
Right. That's basically the end of Groff's case here. Is well,
Yes, it is.
Every employer now has to work that much harder to deny a false religious accommodation because there's only one true religion. So. Anyway, great thoughts, gentlemen. I think we're going to have to revisit some of these things. Travis Schmalhofer, thank you for coming in.
Thanks
Luke
for
Saint,
having
I didn't introduce you guys at the beginning. Luke Saint, check out his book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy. Read it before you get to Rushdoony. All right. And Joel Saint, Executive Director of Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society. Thank you all for coming in. Please go to LancasterPatriot.com for more information about the Lancaster Patriot. Go to patreon.com/the Lancaster Patriot to support the show. And if you are a patron, stick around and Joel and I will do a brief after show. Until next time, remember Christ, not the state, is king. So long.